Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
USAA knows dynamic duos can save the day, like superheroes and sidekicks or auto and home insurance. With USAA, you can bundle your auto and home and save up to 10%. Learn more and get a quote at USAA.com/bundle. Restrictions apply.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to help you make the most of your summer with Michelob Ultra, a superior light beer worth playing for. Play for it with the guys when you're competing to see who can sink more birdies on the golf course, because winning tastes even better with Ultra on the line. Play for Ultra. Fill your fridge with Michelob Ultra this summer. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2025 Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Makkai, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. In Rob Franklin's debut novel, Great Black Hope, David Smith Jr., known as Smith, has put his privilege to the test. The queer black son of a prestigious family from Atlanta, Smith is a graduate of all the right schools, with connections to a black glitterati, awash in beauty and money. An arrest for cocaine possession suddenly throws off the security blanket of wealth and connections, inviting a different, more familiar symbolic register to attach, the symbols that Americans attach without context to black bodies and blackness itself. In an instant, a Stanford degree is no longer enough to defend against more ignominious titles: addict, fatherless, criminal, queer. And in the wake of the mysterious death of his friend Elle, Smith seeks answers to questions about Elle's death and about his own life in her circle of friends and addictions. Cutting back and forth between the Atlanta of his youth and the New York City of Smith's questing adulthood, Great Black Hope draws a picture of the accumulation of cultural and economic capital seemingly required for black men and women to simply live outside the constant pressures of comparison. Comparison to white affectations of morality and dignity, of social class and meritocracy. It is a novel that stares wide-eyed at the manner in which such comparisons have been levied in order to rationalize and maintain a society of exclusion. Formally, it works language like a second skin, a skin that feels sensuous and new, but organic, while unapologetically adorned. There is sentence work to make the heart stop and the pulse race. And all the while, Rob Franklin is tunneling deeper into the original sin of the nation by way of uncovering newer, fresher sins that even money cannot protect you from. Born and raised in Atlanta, Rob Franklin is a writer of fiction, criticism, and poetry, and a co-founder of Art for Black Lives, a Kimbilio Fiction Fellow, and a finalist for the New England Review Emerging Writer Prize. He has published work in the New England Review, Prairie Schooner, and The Rumpus, among others. Rob Franklin holds a BA from Stanford and an MFA from NYU's Creative Writing program. He lives in Brooklyn and teaches writing at the School of Visual Arts. Welcome to Burned by Books, Rob Franklin.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was such a beautiful description.
I really, really love this book, and I could just talk about its form, but the content is so resonant and propulsive and narratively engaging that we'll do all of those things. But I want to start with the Smith family. And you might even say that the Smith family is the American dream, if there ever was such a thing. They are part of a legacy of Black labor and education that created capital for a family, an anchor that holds them steady in a nation of racial violences, macro and micro. But Smith Jr.'s story is one about how quickly all of that work and pain and protection can unravel, revealing that race was the factor that really mattered all along. What drew you to a novel about the instability of Black class markers?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think a good place to start with the family, because I think when I was conceptualizing the novel, I definitely had this family that is so the product of kind of class ascendancy and Black respectability as the sort of central organizing unit.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in the novel, almost like, as you said, the question of how quickly it takes to unravel, decades and generations of work. Like David Smith Jr. is almost in kind of opposition to his grandmother character, whose history we sort of see framed as, she grew up on a sharecropping farm in Texas. So it's basically one generation removed from American slavery and all of its horrors, very much sort of like escapes the kind of racial terror of the American South and becomes one of the first Black women lawyers in Texas and kind of enters into this middle class or upper middle class life that then allows Smith's mother to go to fancy schools, become a surgeon, and produce Smith. And so there is an idea that kind of like all of that work, all of that labor, decades and generations can be undone with a single night of Smith getting arrested for cocaine possession in Southampton at a party. And so the kind of fragility of Black achievement in this country, I think, is very much at the fore of the novel.
Yeah, it's almost, I would say there are moments in which it's a horror novel because, Smith seeing those things unravel before his eyes and also thinking about what it means for, as you say, the quote unquote respectability of a Black family to have that unravel. Did you see it at all as kind of having horror echoes?
It's so interesting. Yeah, I mean, I don't think like consciously think of it as horror, but I think, first of all, I'm very drawn to a kind of like, I love horror as a genre. And I think, the sort of post Get Out, like Jordan Peele, like sort of socially aware horror subgenre is definitely something that like has very, very much informed my artistic sensibility. And I think actually, I feel like when my mom read the book for the first time, she referenced Get Out of like, Smith being in sort of polite white liberal company, but his safety always being in peril. That has a kind of, horror valence to it for sure.
So this is both firmly a New York City novel and an Atlanta novel. And these are two spaces of historic Black life and culture. And importantly for this novel, cities that have large populations of the elite Black moneyed class. What was the draw to representing these two cityscapes as centers of Black life? And did writing Great Black Hope give you a different sense of how these cities differ from one another?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so much of the draw of setting the book in both places is that these are the two cities that have formed me as a person and as a thinker and as a writer, and have so formed my kind of conception of my own like race class identity and how I move through the world. And I think that looks a lot different in New York, for me, as is the case for Smith, where like Smith is living in New York alone as an adult, not with family, essentially, and like is kind of forging a life for himself, largely in the sort of downtown club scene, where his Blackness and his queerness are both an asset because it is something that he can kind of use to maneuver himself into spaces by like by just being unique. Really? Like there is a form of kind of cultural capital that it offers him.
Kind of unicorn status.
For sure. Like in these kind of, again, moneyed, white, glamorous spaces. Yeah, there is something that is kind of like very attractive about this sort of like multiculturalism he represents, so the Black glamour that he represents. Versus in Atlanta, that is a place for him that is so rooted in his family's history and in his parents' world, which is the world of, of historically Black colleges and the Black bourgeoisie and the civil rights movement. It's a very different kind of version of wealthy Blackness.
I was thinking almost, I didn't know if you had this in mind at all, but sort of West Egg, East Egg, like new money, old money, bourgeoisie versus like youth with money.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Gatsby is definitely kind of one of the spiritual forebearers of this novel, and certainly in its depiction of New York. But that's interesting, like in terms of its depiction of Atlanta as well. Like there's a book called Our Kind of People. I can't remember. I think it's Lawrence Otis Graham that I was reading as I was writing the Atlanta section. That is basically attempting to it's a book of nonfiction that's attempting to document basically the history of the Black bourgeoisie. And it opens with this passage that's like, I think it's something like, Lena Horne is, but like Whitney Houston is not. And like going through these Black celebrities and basically saying who is like a member of the sort of Black bourgeoisie and who is a member of just like a wealthy Black celebrity. So basically imposing a kind of like rigid class structure that we see in something like Gatsby, or that we see in kind of like old money, like waspy white circles, onto the kind of Black American context. And yeah, like within the sort of Black American framework, the Smiths are, a family that is very steeped in respectability, elite education, versus like a kind of, even more extravagant, but ultimately like socially structured very differently sort of Black wealth.
Have you seen or enjoyed the HBO show South Side?
I have not seen it yet.
It just has, I mean, it's doing such heavy parody work with it, but its depictions of the Black bourgeoisie and the way in which there is, the degree of exclusion and exclusivity is part of the kind of creating protective boundaries around that wealth and status. And I felt that here. I mean, there's discussions of, going outside the perimeter and what happens when one is a different kind of white person or Black person. And I wondered if you'd thought about like how those basically cataracted boundaries end up being sort of self-defeating a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think especially like with Black wealth or with just the Black community generally, the sort of like Du Boisian notion of the talented 10th is a way of like, I mean, it's rooted in scarcity. It's a way of taking a community that is already like marginalized and kind of disenfranchised and like further like stratifying it in a way that I do think is kind of ultimately self-defeating, but nonetheless happens. And I think this sort of exclusionary practices that happen in the Black community are often like as if not more overt than ones that you would see in kind of like contemporary like white social spaces, in part because like there's a little bit less of you're a bit more protected from scrutiny, I would say, like to have, in an organization like Jack and Jill that, I grew up in, which is largely comprised of sort of upper middle class, like quote unquote, the right kind of Black family. I remember stories growing up of my mom saying like someone she knew couldn't get in because like they didn't graduate college, like, the mother hadn't graduated college or XYZ thing that had kind of, led to you being kind of alienated in those exclusively Black social spaces.
I'd love for you to read a short section from Great Black Hope for us to get your language and voice in our ears. This section is an after party that is glamorous and decadent. How would you introduce us to Smith's relationship to this kind of space?
Yeah. So, I mean, in this scene, Smith is literally a +1 to his friend Carolyn, who is a glamorous, wealthy, white New Yorker, native New Yorker, who's brought him to the opening of a restaurant owned by a celebrity chef she's just begun a relationship with. Come, you two, said Rune, reemerging from the crowd into which he had disappeared like a motherless child. He announced proudly that the after party had begun, then led them through the storied hidden door. Inside was bedlam. The room trapped a smoky miasma through which they sifted, passing a marble card table surrounded by a flock of Swannish models who arched their slender backs. A bald man laughed lavishly beside the women and swished his drink, wetting one, who scowled, stood, and wandered off. Ambiently, a techno track played, scoring other vignettes. It was all the seduction. Conversations teetered just on this side of sex. The ever-elusive cool party, yet Smith felt outside of it still, like a ghost in the corporeal plane yearning to be embodied. There was a perceptible difference in this room and the next, two spaces of equal exclusivity, distinguished instead by milieu. In the main dining room, the remaining press corps snapped photographs of the uptown set, the few critics remaining. They were the ones who could afford the restaurant, who would return and rack up bills with bottles of vintage champagne. But it was the kids in the back who would breathe it with life, who would keep it from losing this initial flash of cool to become mausoleum of consumption and commerce. Rune's eyes lit up as he watched Carolyn disappear into the arms of a rakish acquaintance. Your friend is very sexy, he said to Smith. And because Smith wasn't sure how to respond, he didn't. Instead, he stared for a moment at a drink on the bar, the white orb of fruit iridescent in its vodka bath, then picked it up and sipped it deeply, thinking that it was the single best thing he'd ever tasted. Without a word, Smith left Rune and began to roam. In the room's animal heat, he felt himself start to sweat, to sway. He bummed a cigarette from a handsome man in a cashmere sweater who insisted he stay, introducing him to a table of stylish strangers who laughed at his first joke, It's Giving Darkroom by Halston, and continued to laugh. Smith remembered he was funny, was fun. He remembered that he was a delight at parties, loved parties even, a fact which, taking another drink from a passing tray, he said aloud, a statement so earnest it might have put off these posh cosmopolitans, but tonight touched on something they'd all quietly felt. Pop song played, and they stood up to dance, Smith whisking around the boy whose friends called him Adam, attempting a swing move that, performed successfully, would have made them appear to come undone like a plait, but unsuccessfully left them tangled and breathless and howling with laughter at the edge of the room. Adam's breath, when they kissed, smelled of lychee and spearmint. Smith had a fourth drink, a fifth, and slumped to a corner from which he was plucked promptly. Come save me from these white people, said Kofi, bringing creme brulee vapor in Smith's open mouth. A poreless 30-something who'd spent a decade in nightlife seemingly against his will, he had a penchant for bringing up topics ill-suited to dance floors, eager to prove his intellectual depth. Tonight it was Elle's case, the shroud of silence surrounding it. He hadn't seen any updates and was desperate to know what exactly went down that night, his lupine features aglow. Smith invented an excuse to leave, then drank his sixth drink in line for the restroom, which, trickling forward, revealed another function inside. At least 20 in attendance, themselves across the gender spectrum, despite the door sign's demands. Passé, besides no one was pissing. The stall walls barely shielded the hunched-over cokesters, sniffing and snorting in chorus, while others adjusted their hairdos and half-tucks in the mirror. One lank-haired gauntling shoveled something more antisocial into her nose, an opie look in her eyes. Smith couldn't help but tally, by approximation, the jail time's worth of substances passing in and around these stalls. He headed straight for the sinks and saw, on his own face, a woozy expression. If he had a bump, one bump, he could keep up the night. Another hour at least, he could waft through the crowd, swapping jokes, swapping spit. Wordlessly, Smith left the bathroom and re-entered the party's soft moan. Bodies shifted in and out of focus as he searched for Carolyn to tell her goodbye, to thank Rune for having him, overcome with the sudden sensation that if he didn't leave now, he would never. Not finding them, he veered for the door, past the bar where a throng of men danced. He shrugged off Adam's hand on his shoulder, turned to offer a smile, then left him in the eager darkness. The light in the dining room was incredibly bright, phosphines like embers, as he paused for his eyes to adjust. It was empty now except for staff, a couple dozen, dumping plates of hors d'oeuvres into garbage bags, their translucent gray skins bulging with discarded remains. Half-drunk coupes packed 10 to a tray sailed toward the industrial kitchen, and across that sea, in the opposite corner, he saw them, Rune and Carolyn, mere inches apart. Her hair fell like a drape across her bare shoulder, framing the heart of her face, now flushed, as she took a sip of something amber, her expression desirous, delirious. It was not the encaring performance she'd mastered, the way she hitched her body to his, the way she indulged him. It was awful to see her like this, so nakedly wanting. And even as the room shimmered in his own drunken vision, Smith recognized the core of his feeling, seeing her forfeit this latest bid at sobriety, their unspoken pact. For the fleeting thrill this flirtation offered was rage. He felt an urge to drag her screaming from that room. Instead, he passed through the laboring bodies and left.
Not all meals are created equal. For instance, breakfast has the spicy egg McMuffin for a limited time, and lunch doesn't. McDonald's breakfast comes first. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast Gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast Gems.
Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar, zero patience for slow walkers, those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night, have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
Thank you so much. This section features a couple of my favorite of your phrases, which are throughout the novel, just really sort of have you pause in your tracks as you're reading because they feel so original and lively and electric. But the soft moan of the party and then the creme brulee vapor of the guy's breath are two of my very favorites. And it's clear that you have a real poet's love for texturing language, having language speak and sound differently. And I'd wonder if you would talk both about, what your line craft is like, but also talk about the language of the novel and the way it both weaves into and contrasts with the other kinds of language that we encounter in dialogue in the novel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess since you pointed out, like I do think I have a kind of poet sensibility in the sense that, I mean, I came to writing through poetry, had been writing poetry for a decade before I kind of attempted a novel. And so I think always with writing, so much of the pleasure to me comes from finding like the right rhythm to a sentence and trying to strike a kind of balance of what can be kind of like maximalist, very ornate descriptions. And as you said, like a sort of realism in the dialogue. And so I think the kind of line level work, I mean, I often, when I'm reading, I'm reading out loud. Even when it was just reading, I'm reading from the galley and I can see little places where I made small edits afterwards, like before the final version. And so it's like, so much of my kind of line level work is done by just reading things out loud. If you see me writing in a cafe, I'm at least mouthing every speech that I'm kind of editing and where I'm getting.
New Yorkers be aware for Rob Franklin muttering to himself.
Keep an eye out. And so, that's, I think, how a lot of the line level work is happening. And also, I mean, that was, I think, one of the benefits of having other people read, both in when I did my MFA and then once I'd sold the book with my editor, is seeing where like there's maybe a turn too many in a sentence and like one description too many. And I think a passage can kind of collapse on itself and become sort of like precious in this way that, I don't want to be.
When I talk to my students about this, sometimes I say that you don't want it to be the pulse of every sentence. You don't want it to sort of end on a heartbeat that's always a turn of phrase, because then it becomes a gimmick rather than an organic skin of language.
Totally. And yeah, you have to know what to like call attention to. Like not everything, deserves a sort of like ornate imagistic description.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like, and I think I benefit a lot from having other writers, and especially having like, I mean, I think I mentioned that in grad school, my thesis advisor was this writer named Katie Kitamura, who is so great. And I think is like,
she's one of my favorite writers working today.
Yeah, same. And I mean, obviously her style is so like pristine and kind of like
spare.
Spare, like highly stylized minimalism, I sometimes call it. And like, she is a very good line editor as a result, where she can like see where my style, which is maybe more maximalist, like where it's working and where it's like doing too much. And so she was such a useful reader for many sections of this book. Yeah. And then with dialogue, I want dialogue to feel realistic, but I also want it to feel purposeful. Like, I don't think you have to you can put things in description or exposition that like are not interesting to hear at a character's mouth. And then just save the dialogue for like lines that do something on the level of character or still feel like kind of interesting, even as they are, realistic to something a person would actually say.
Yeah, I like that. So there's a section of the novel titled Down South, and we get a brief history of the Smith family's rise, focusing on Smith's grandmother, Gail, who through her education and really jet engine of fear and desire to protect those around her, specifically the Black men in her lives, creates a boundary around her eventual growing family. The driving catalyst for that fear and desire is the lynching of a promising young man who had his eye on Gail. This brief historical return reminds us of the present threat of violence that runs underneath these questions that Smith Jr. takes on. How does the lynching reappear again in different forms in Great Black Hope? And why did you want to look backward at that earlier moment to have us have a different sense of Smith Jr.?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, initially that section with the grandmother flashback was towards the beginning of the book rather than at the beginning of the Down South section, which is the middle section of the novel. And I think it started to make a lot more sense to me once I placed it where it now is. Like, this section, Down South, is, again, a very history-focused section. Like, it's both focused on the sort of distant history of the Smith family via like his grandmother and sort of Smith's like childhood memory. And within that section, we see, yes, like the description of this lynching that kind of, led Gail to escaping the sort of rural Deep South and moving to Houston, which then kind of set her on this upwardly mobile trajectory. And then we see it kind of refracted through other forms of kind of like still legal like lynchings of, the criminal justice system and the war on drugs, forms of instilling terror in Black people and Black men, and exercising a kind of institutional and systemic control over the Black community in ways that, are obviously still prevalent and worse than ever today. And so having a character whose life saw, those kind of transitions, insidious as they are, of a kind of violent, like racial terrorism in the deep rural South to a sort of legalized institutional racism in the urban South and across America today. Yeah, it felt like really important context for Smith's narrative and his experience of the criminal justice system, that we're aware that this is existing in a lineage.
Mm-hmm. And a quite recent lineage. This is just really a kind of generation and a bit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And also, I mean, we also then see within the grandmother's story, we see that once she kind of ascended to this upper middle class position, her husband was, in essence, a slumlord, Smith's grandfather. And so even within that story, you know, I don't want it to be as simplistic as the oppressed can never become the oppressor. Like, I don't want anyone to be kind of morally simplistic in my work. And I think there is a complexity to the way that Gale thinks about the world, and the way that this family, the Smith family, is like benefiting from the sort of, as we were talking about, like exclusionary tactics that keep that stratify people within the Black community and like create something like a Black elite, but are also, you know, victims of or party to, you know, these kind of like larger American machinations around race and class.
There's a famous and infamous Frantz Fanon quote in Great Black Hope, quote, "The Negro is comparison." Fanon was thinking specifically about the psychological underpinnings of how racial inequity is enacted via self-comparison in the Black man. As much as he can do to sort of raise himself up and to make himself known and carry the symbols of success and value in culture, he'll always compare himself unfavorably to white standards. But I think you're wanting to think both about that poisonous self-comparison, but also about the various layers of comparison that happen within Black communities, between the wealthy and the privileged and the not, and between white and Black communities where comparison can get you killed. So will you take on Fanon for us in Smith's world?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, something I really love in Fanon's work is, as you said, that it's not just looking like externally or structurally. It's more looking at, the kind of psychological impact. I mean, I was really interested in what the kind of psychological impact of the sort of like twice as good Black respectability philosophy is for the people who are kind of raised in and like schooled in it. So, I mean, we see littered through the Atlanta section people who kind of fall victim to a sort of relentless focus on achievement, not because they necessarily like, you know, are ensnared by like the criminal justice system or poverty or anything like that, but many because of psychological effects. So their oppression is in some ways like internalized and like, shows up in their actual kind of bodies. And so, I mean, I think Smith is becoming aware of the effect of that, again, like relentless focus on respectability and achievement in his own life, the way that it's kept him from really knowing himself, the way that it's created a system of like impossible expectations where like any sort of failure, you know, feels like he's disappointing generations of his family and collapsing, you know, like there's not really room for error. And, you know, he's made a substantial one. And so like the kind of, there is a world in which he never recovers from that because he falters young and like, you know, I kind of loses his footing. And I think that there are plenty of people who struggle to recover from that. And I think in kind of understanding this Frantz Fanon sort of idea around almost like the pathology or psychosis of Black achievement, there's a kind of salvation in that, in like untethering himself to that.
And the part of this kind of, I think, awareness of comparison and also the kind of the buried psychological self-comparison is wanting to be recognized, meaning, in the broadest sense, recognized as a whole human, when you're in a society that operates via symbols for Blackness. And this is one of the things that most preoccupies Smith about his friend Elle's death, is that he worries over how she will be reduced to a non-recognizable full person and turned into a set of symbols that are easily recognized as, in this case, tragic Blackness. And I wonder if you could talk about that, the fear of the reduction into a symbolic register that sort of also comes out of this phenomenon.
Yeah. So, a lot of Smith's frustration in the aftermath of his best friend Elle's death, which is kind of covered relentlessly in tabloids and in the press, is, the reduction of her story to kind of easily digestible and like clickable symbols. And, the desire of a media ecosystem to feed people a story of archetypes that they recognize, that elides her full humanity. And that then, I think, also highlights for him how that's happening to him, both in the court system and recovery rooms as he's moving through them, being viewed as like a Black addict. And also how that's always been happening to him. Like, the options being sort of upstanding Black man, with kind of Obama-like aspirations, or being sort of downwardly spiraling Black tragic story. Those sort of two paths being presented to him, both paths rife with symbols that are ultimately completely reductive and don't kind of view him as a person.
And both of those sort of reductions have real material consequences for him in his treatment recovery with I'm forgetting the guy's name, the Italian.
Mancini, yeah.
Mancini. Yeah, with Mancini's ridiculous, basically like self-castigation form of recovery, and also in the justice system, where he realizes that, his nicely cut suit and his father sitting behind him are a plus, but the number of negatives that come just, via Blackness and its catalog of symbols in the American system are much bigger and more powerful. And I wonder if you could get into a little bit about the AA scenes, some of which kind of are, easily recognizable, and some of which I think you're trying to kind of draw them into different spaces and give them a different character. And then also how this adds to a kind of like categorization that Smith is running as fast as he can away from.
Yeah. So in these recovery rooms, I mean, I think Smith is very aware of the way he is like performing his own identity in those recovery spaces, as well as like the assumptions that are being made about him. And he enters, especially in the Mancini space, because that is like essentially the court-ordered recovery. He recognizes that he needs something from Mancini, which is basically a sort of letter of approval. And so he is both resisting and leaning into certain expectations or sort of like symbolic reductions of his personhood, because they seem to be what this quote unquote doctor wants from him. And so
quote unquote is right.
Yeah. And so like, as a person who is very practiced in performing his own identity and like in a way kind of weaponizing his own identity, this is a sort of, final boss test of that. Like, can you play whatever version of you that this doctor wants to see, that the lawyer wants to see, that the judge wants to see, whatever they think that you are and like need to become for them to kind of let you go. That's what you need to give them. You don't need to like try to complicate their view of you.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that happening, I think, in the court-ordered recovery. And then in AA, especially, I mean, he goes to his first AA at basically the LGBT center in a kind of group of predominantly gay white men. And it feels, in a
Men
way,
who carry the 13th step of like having an incredibly shredded physique,
yeah, precisely.
as you would say.
Yeah. And like, he, in that space, I think he's wanting to bring a kind of more authentic version of himself in a way, but then still coming up against his own baggage around like belonging within this community that he's like not really a part of as a result of his race and like all of the kind of more subtle, insidious racism that happens in the gay community. And so, yeah, I mean, in both spaces, there's a sort of alienation and like an inability to kind of like show all of himself and therefore like access community.
Rob, before I let you go, I'd love to know what you've been reading and loving recently, and if you have any recommendations for my listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I already mentioned Katie earlier in the episode, but I read Katie Kitamura's new book, Audition.
It's next
recently.
on my TBR list.
It's so fantastic. And I think it just felt really exciting structurally. I keep comparing it to Mulholland Drive for people.
Ooh. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, now I'm doubly in.
Where, yeah, I mean, I think it just like kind of reinvigorated my understanding of what fiction can do. And yeah, it's just, I mean, really tremendous. And then I read this book by Josh Duboff called Early 30s, which is another New York City novel, by turns like wry and comic, and like also a kind of really heartfelt look at friendships and the way they're kind of like complicated by age and like different life circumstances. And I really tore through that, found it really funny. Yeah. And then I just started another book that's creative nonfiction, this book called Blessings and Disasters by Alexis Okiolo, which is blended memoir and kind of reportage about Alabama, where they grew up. And it really reminds me of like Didion's writing about the South. It has the sort of like elegance of that prose style, but is also like more heartfelt because Alexis grew up there, and there's a more just like complicated relationship to the American South and to Blackness within the American South that definitely resonated and had a lot of kind of overlap with concerns in my work.
Well, these are 3 wonderful recommendations, but I wish that I could show my audience how many pages of Great Black Hope I have dog-eared just because I was either stunned by something in the prose or called to by something in the narrative. And that's a sign for me of an extraordinary book. And I'm hoping that everyone will run out and grab Great Black Hope by Rob Franklin. You will not be disappointed. And Rob, it was such a treat to get to talk to you and to really delve into some of the very serious and important questions that this novel raises.
Yes, thank you so much, Chris.
Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to Rob Franklin for coming on to talk about his debut, Great Black Hope. You can find links to purchase Great Black Hope and all of Rob's recommendations at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.